سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His blessings and His mercy that He has shown us, and I seek His forgiveness for myself and for all of us and for all mu'mineen and mu'minat for our sins and our shortcomings. We have been talking about the wisdom and the purpose of the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And today I would like to look at a selection of a very famous sermon, and perhaps the most famous, or at the very least one of the most famous sayings of the beloved daughter of our Prophet, Fatima al-Zahra, salamullahi alayha. When the Prophet's gift of Fadak was taken from his daughter, Sayyidah Fatima Zahra, salamullahi alayha, she argued for her right to that land. And in some cases, there were people who thought that this was a dispute about inheritance. It was not a dispute about inheritance, because Fadak was not the inheritance of Sayyidah Fatima from the Prophet, but rather it was her property during the lifetime of the Prophet. It was her property which was in her control and in her ownership, but just like the pattern of Imam Ali alayhi salam was, and the pattern of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam was in general, they did not make any decisions about their own lives and their own property without first consulting Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. So when Imam Hassan was born, Sayyidah Fatima did not say, "This is my son, I am going to name him what I choose." Imam Ali alayhi salam did not say, "This is my son, I am going to name him what I choose." Or when Imam Hussein was born, or when any major life decision came, whether with regard to marriage, with regard to any other issue, they didn't say, "Well, this is my choice, my decision, and therefore I will make that decision according to what I want." This was not just because the Prophet was a prophet and ma'soom, but it was also because this is the adab and the way of Muslims to honor their elders, and in particular their parents, by seeking their blessings and by seeking their advice and guidance, even if the decision is mine and not theirs to make. So if Fadak was sometimes dispersed or managed by the Prophet, then it wasn't because it was his property and not the property of Sayyidah Fatima al-Zahra, salamullahi alayha. Instead, it was because the adab and the respect of Fatima al-Zahra for her father and for the Prophet was such that even with respect to her right and with respect to her property, she gave preference and priority to the command and the wish of the Prophet. And Imam Ali alayhi salam did the same thing, and that was the seerah of Ahlul Bayt, and that was the teaching of Ahlul Bayt. The only difference, of course, is that when you give that honor to a ma'soom, their decision or their advice will always be exactly what is the best course of action. And in other cases, it is possible that I will seek the advice or the honor of a parent or of an elder, and they may not have the experience or they may not have the knowledge to be able to give the best advice. And so, in some cases, we may not always follow their opinion or their advice, but to ask and to seek to accommodate their preference. And if possible, take their advice is still part of our adab and our way of life as Muslims. Of course, if it is a non-ma'soom, then we have to judge their advice and their preference on the standard of our religion. And if there is a difference, we prefer and we follow what Allah has commanded. But if there is a compatibility and maybe it is not what we would have liked, then we accommodate and we seek to honor and continue to do ihsan to our elders, to our parents, to our relatives, whether or not we are able to fully apply what they may like us to do or what they may instruct us to do. So Fadak was the property of Fatima al-Zahra, salamullahi alayha, even during the lifetime of our Prophet. It wasn't a matter of inheritance. The second confusion that people sometimes have is that maybe this was a dispute about property. It wasn't inheritance, it was the property of the Prophet's daughter. But it wasn't a case that she brought towards the court of the Caliph in order to regain her material property. But rather, Fadak was given to Ahlul Bayt and to the person of Fatima al-Zahra, salamullahi alayha, in order to assist them in preaching and spreading the message of Islam. And Fadak was given, in one sense, in exchange for the sacrifices of the mother of Sayyida Fatima, which was al-Mu'mineen Khadija alayha salam. She gave her entire wealth in order to strengthen and to spread Islam. And so Fadak was given to Sayyida Fatima in recognition that what would have been her inheritance was spent on the Muslims. But now what is given to Sayyida Fatima as the compensation, or we can say as the recognition of the loss of that inheritance, it also was not for Sayyida Fatima to use herself, but rather for her to continue as her mother did and as her father did, to use whatever resources Allah had given her materially for the strengthening of Islam. And that is where the khutbah of Fadak, known as al-Khutbah al-Fadakiyya, it comes from. It describes the importance of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Quran, and it describes the purpose of the laws of Islam. So in one way, Sayyida Fatima was telling the Muslim Ummah and the Caliphate that had taken her property unjustly that you should know that the proper use of this material resource is only going to be there if it is under the control and the authority of Ahlul Bayt, because they know what are the priorities and the purposes of the commandments of Islam. If somebody does not have that wisdom, they do not have that guidance, then maybe they will want to encourage Islamic practice and they will undermine it without realizing it. So maybe I will encourage you to pray, but I will do so in a way that will make you dislike the call to prayer, because you will associate it with anger or with harshness or with compulsion. My intention may even be good, but because I don't have the insight and I don't have the knowledge of the way and the purpose, I may not be able to accomplish that goal. Let alone that many people, they don't even have good intentions. And they just want to use religion for their personal enrichment, or to gain power, or to gain influence. It's not always the case that people who claim to have the best interest of Islam at heart truly have the best interest of Islam at heart. And in Islam, we had both of these tragedies. Some people were sincere, but they didn't know what the priorities and the purposes of the Islamic teachings were. And so where they wished to do good, they may not have done good. And that is how Imam Ali described the Khawarij. They sought to worship, but because they were ill-informed and because they were arrogant and because they turned their back on Ahlul Bayt, they sought the truth, but they missed the target and they missed the goal. And then, of course, there are those who sought what is evil, sought to misuse religion, and they hit their target and they were able to reach it. So you have man talaba al-haq fa-akhta'a, the Khawarij. They wanted to get to a good place, but because they were ignorant and they were ill-informed, they didn't reach it. And then you have those man talaba al-batil fa-asaba. They are seeking falsehood by misusing religion, and they were able to attain their evil and their very damaging goal. In Islam, this khutbah of Fadak reminds us of many things. What is the purpose of our Islamic teaching and commandments? And it also reminds us of the importance of being able to understand what are the priorities of Islam in order for us to be able to even perform our prayer and our fasting and our worship and get the proper outcome from those acts. It reminds us, in addition, that all of our material resources, they are for a religious purpose and not the other way around. So what is that section in which Sayyidah Fatimah al-Zahra salamullahi alayha, she describes the purposes of the commandments of Islam, the shara'i', the ahkam, the laws. She says, as part of the khutbah, جَعَلَ اللَّهُ الْإِيمَانَ تَطْهِيرًا لَكُم مِّنَ الشِّرْكِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made Iman to purify you from shirk. Sometimes people ask, why is it so important for a person to believe in God? Why do you have to believe in one God? There are people who don't believe in one God, or maybe they don't believe in God at all, and they seem to be good people. Maybe they're pleasant, they're kind, they're helpful, they're generous, and all of that might be true. But inherently not to recognize what is true and not to submit to what is true, not to recognize where we come from and where we are going, it is a pollution of the soul. Just like if somebody is a very pleasant person, but they believe that the moon landing was fake and the earth is flat, and maybe the moon landing was fake, I really have no way of knowing, but hypothetically speaking, if somebody believes in every conspiracy, they might be a very pleasant person. But at some point you're going to say, you know what, I have to kind of stay a little bit away. They're going to have a bad effect on my mind. And maybe some of us have been around those conspiracy theorists, and when you talk to them for too long, you start to feel like you are unsteady, because everything is the opposite of what it seems. So if that's the case about simple, who cares if the moon landing was faked or real? I mean, it matters in terms of our knowledge of the physical world around us, but it doesn't affect us on a day-to-day level. And some of those other conspiracies, they're also not going to affect us directly. Some more severe, some less severe. But it messes with our mind on a much more fundamental level if somebody doesn't recognize the truth of the spiritual world. You might not perceive the harm right away, but just like a person who denies hygiene can pollute a community or a society, can spread disease or sickness, just like a person who is anti-intellectual can spread harm in society, a person who doesn't recognize the truth can also create pollution of values and morals and priorities within society. That doesn't mean that we condemn or we judge or we act unkindly, but we should recognize that Iman is purification. جَعَلَ اللَّهُ الْإِيمَانَ تَطْهِيرًا لَكُم مِّنَ الشِّرْكِ. And when we are not in an environment among mu'mineen, you should be pleasant and kind, but you should recognize that you are in a polluted environment, no matter how pleasant or no matter how fun it might be. And you should wish in your heart to escape and to come among those people who are not polluted, because Iman is a purification. وَالصَّلَاةَ تَنْزِيهًا لَكُمْ عَنِ الْكِبْرِ. Now I will go quickly through the remaining things. They are in some way self-explanatory. Prayer has been legislated to protect us from arrogance. The most important part of prayer is sujood. And sujood is the most vulnerable position that you can put yourself in. You can't see in front of you or to either side or behind. If somebody were to come and to wish you harm, sujood is the one state where you are the most vulnerable, the least able to fend for yourself, and the least able even to see what is coming. And maybe that is why kings would want people to prostrate before them to symbolically express that vulnerability towards a king. But a Muslim does not have that level of vulnerability, that trust fall for anybody but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is not humiliating, but it is humbling. And it is a humility that does not humiliate you, but rather gives you honor, because it takes away the kibr and the arrogance that is within our soul. Then Sayyidah Fatima continues, وَالزَّكَاةَ صَلَاةً عَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ وَعَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ وَالزَّكَاةَ تَزْكِيَةً لِلنَّفْسِ. When you give zakat, you are not giving charity. You are not doing a favor to another person. You are purifying yourself. Having wealth, having power and influence is always potentially corrupting, because I can feel like I have honor and I should be able to control other people's lives or their decisions through my money, my influence, my power. And sometimes that substitutes for presence and for sincerity. I think that I can fund and other people can do the work. Zakat brings me back down to the earth, and it reminds me that money is something that comes and that it goes. It is at best a means in order to worship and serve and obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if it doesn't do that, then not having it is better than having it. Because if I don't have it, I'm not responsible. But if I have it and I don't use it to obey Allah, then I am answerable and liable to punishment. So zakat is a means to purify yourself and to bring yourself back down to earth and to recognize what is the true value of your material possessions, to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and nothing else. And then the second benefit of zakat is وَنَمَاءً فِي الرِّزْقِ. When you give zakat, it increases your rizq. Don't think of it as something that is being taken away, but rather it is an insurance and it is an investment that increases your rizq. وَالصِّيَامَ تَثْبِيتًا لِلْإِخْلَاصِ. Fasting is something that strengthens your sincerity. There is a potential for prayer, although prayer is amud-ud-din. It is the pillar of our religion. But there is the potential for prayer to make us arrogant. One of the unique things about fasting is that you will only truly fast if you are doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a shortcut and one of the best ways to practice sincerity. Because right now, if you offer me a drink, I can lie to you and I can say that I'm fasting to show off and to impress you. But then 20 minutes later, I will be alone. And then if it was a lie, if it was insincere, then I will get a drink because I was thirsty. I will get a bite because I was hungry. If I still fast when I am alone, and you will always have a period when you are alone, then that is practice to do it only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It still takes effort because there are people who impress themselves. Maybe you are not present, but my nafs is present. And so I want to feel like I am good and I am better than somebody else, so I still need to fight that nafs when I am alone. But fasting makes it easier because unlike prayer, unlike recitation of Quran, unlike Hajj, it is more private and more intimate. And so Siyam is a special way of practicing sincerity. Again, there is much more that can be said about each of these acts of worship, but to move quickly, وَالْحَجَّ تَشْيِيدًا لِلدِّينِ. Hajj is meant not to be a ritual, not to be just a trip, but a means of strengthening the faith. And the season of Hajj is coming. There are many of us who made dua to go for Hajj in the month of Ramadan. May Allah answer that prayer, if not this year, then in the very near future. There are some of us who are intending to go. May Allah grant them the ability to perform Hajj and to have an accepted pilgrimage and to perform all of the manasik and the worship. Hajj is not just those rituals, but Hajj is meant to be a way of strengthening the religion, and that is because Hajj is meant to bring us close to our Imam and to Ahlul Bayt so that we can learn from them and that we can offer our obedience to them. And then the hadith continues, وَالْعَدْلُ تَنْسِيقًا لِلْقُلُوبِ. Justice is what brings the hearts in organization and brings them in order and together. Islam is a religion that is rooted in granting justice. وَطَاعَتَنَا نِظَامًا لِلْمِلَّةِ. And then obedience to Ahlul Bayt is what brings a structure and a cohesion to the Muslim community. That cohesion does not come through force, but it comes through divine guidance and through the authentic teachings of Ahlul Bayt. وَالصَّبْرَ مَعُونَةً عَلَى اسْتِجَابِ الْأَجْرِ. And patience and forbearance is an assistance in seeking reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You don't forbear because your strength is going to carry you to success. You forbear because that is an attribute that Allah likes. And then Allah gives you His reward and He gives you victory. That's a very fine and a very profound distinction. Sometimes people think that religion is a crutch. And so if you don't believe in any fairy tale and you don't believe in any God in the sky, then you will be empowered to take your destiny in your own hands. But the reality is that there is a moral law that governs the universe. And when you humble yourself before that law, that is when you truly become empowered and strengthened to be able to serve the truth and to take control of your destiny. Not to command, but to be able to be true to the purpose for which you are created. That's not a fairy tale. That is a much more profound victory than can ever be attained by material means. And the greatest example of that is the sacrifice of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in Karbala. By all material means, that was a hopeless situation. But because there are not just material laws that govern the universe, it was the greatest victory that continues to create victory and create inspiration, even centuries and more than 1,000 years after the battle took place. That victory is repeated every time somebody says, Labbaik ya Hussein. That victory is repeated every time somebody says that I dissociate from Yazid and from the enemies of Ahlul Bayt, and I follow and I seek to obey the path of Ahlul Bayt and the path of Imam Hussein. So we can see that istijab al-ajr, that is a means of a greater strength than is ever possible through material means. It is all that we have time for, but this was a summary of the purpose of some of our Islamic laws that we have in the sermon of Sayyidah Fatima al-Zahra salamullahi alayha for Fadak. Remember that through this sermon she reminded the Muslims that she did not seek Fadak because it was personal property and she wanted that wealth, but rather because this was the means to be able to serve and strengthen Islam. And when it was taken from her and it was taken from Ahlul Bayt, all of these laws and all of these noble goals, they were also taken from the Muslim Ummah. And so it was a tragedy for Ahlul Bayt, but it was a tragedy for the mu'mineen. And it was a tragedy for humanity, and it was a tragedy for all of God's creation when the purpose of Islam was subverted in that tragic manner. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to remember and to learn from and to honor the purposes for which He gave us His guidance and His commandments. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. Fasalli li rabbika wanhar. Inna shani'aka huwa al-abtar. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين لا سيما علي أمير المؤمنين وعلى فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين وعلى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة وعلي بن الحسين زين العابدين ومحمد بن علي الباقر وجعفر بن محمد الصادق وموسى بن جعفر الكاظم وعلي بن موسى الرضا ومحمد بن علي الجواد وعلي بن محمد الهادي والحسن بن علي الزكي العسكري والحجة بن الحسن القائم المهدي صلوات الله عليهم أجمعين صلوات. In the second khutbah, I will just give a reminder to myself and to all of us of the importance of taqwa, consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and piety. In the words of Sayyidah Fatima in the closing of this same khutbah of Fadak, she says, after explaining the importance of the divine commandments and teachings of Islam, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ حَقَّ تُقَاتِهِ وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ, quoting the Quran, be pious and conscious of Allah as you ought to be aware and conscious of Allah, and make sure that you do not die except in the state of submission to Allah. And the only way to make sure that our final moment is in a state of submission is to live every moment in a state of submission, because we don't know when our final moment is. Sometimes it is our expectation that we will live a long life and we will die a natural death, but so many circumstances come, and we have seen it in others, and the same is possible for our own life. May Allah protect us. But we can never predict. So the only way to make sure that my final moment is in a state of faith is for every moment to be in a state of faith and submission. وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ فِيمَا أَمَرَكُمْ وَنَهَاكُمْ. And obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in what He has commanded you to do and what Allah has forbidden you from doing. فَإِنَّهُ إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاءِ. Sayyidah Fatima once again, she quotes the Quran. Only those who know what God has commanded are able to have true fear and true humility before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah grant us ilm, and may Allah grant us khashiyah, knowledge of His commandments and humility before His presence and fear of His justice and awe of His attributes and His mercy, so that we are always conscious of our presence before Allah and being watched over by Allah, and always seeking His pleasure and His reward in this world and in our eternal life in the hereafter. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Inna Allaha ya'muru bil adli wal ihsani wa ita'i dhil qurba wa yanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkari wal baghi ya'idhukum la'allakum tadhakkarun. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Salatul Jumu'ah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Aliyan waliyullah. Hayya ala as-salah, hayya ala as-salah, hayya ala al-falah, hayya ala al-falah. حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل